Well, hey, thanks for joining us tonight for a midweek Bible study. I'm here with David Palman, and we're glad that you're with us. If you are watching this, especially if you're watching on Facebook, I'd like for you to do something. First thing I'd like for you to do is go ahead and hit the like button or hit that heart button on the video there. And if you're willing to, share that feed so that you can share it with somebody else, and maybe that'll invite some others to join us. And while you're at it, go ahead and drop a comment. Let us know you're watching. Just say hey in the comments, or hey, we're watching, but we're glad that you're with us tonight. So we're gonna be talking about this idea of making decisions tonight. But I was thinking about this earlier, David. If you could take one button from the TV remote, and we want you to answer this question in the comments if you're watching with us on Facebook Live. But if you could take one button off of the TV remote and be able to use it in real life, which one would it be?
That's a tough question. I probably would definitely not do the record button.
Yeah.
But on a day like today, with today's events, I'd probably either want to hit mute or what I did a little bit ago and just turn it off.
Yeah. There's been a lot going on in our country today. I know many, it's kind of a heartbreaking day of what many of us have seen on the news that's going on in Washington, D.C. and places like Atlanta, Georgia. A lot of craziness right now. What are your thoughts?
It is disheartening a little bit, and when we look at the decisions of others, sometimes their decisions don't always just impact that person. Sometimes our decisions impact other people as well.
Yeah. So for me, it would be the rewind button. I'd like to hit that rewind button on the remote, maybe kind of play an event over again. As I was thinking about that earlier today, that rewind button, it would only be in certain occasions where I want to play it and not necessarily relive it, but do it all over again for the rewind button and maybe have a whole new track. And unlike you, sometimes that mute button would be good. Maybe the pause button, just kind of pause life where it's at, especially raising kids. I'm sure you would agree. There's times where you wish you could just hit that pause button. But let us know in the comments. We want to share some of your responses. And hopefully you have a TV remote. I find myself controlling my TV from my phone sometimes now, which is kind of crazy to think about. But tell us, what would you pick off of the remote for a superpower or something that you could use in real life? So have you ever asked yourself the question, why did I do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Too many times.
Yes. And for me, it's kind of recently. And it's usually a question that I've asked myself and that we ask ourselves because of regret, something that wish I could change over. So we're going to spend our night tonight and then over the next several weeks talking about a book that I recently picked up called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. So life is all about decisions. David, why do we make bad decisions?
That's a magic question.
Yeah.
And I know when I ask my kids that question, it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the reality is that's a pretty good answer. Most of the time we don't know why we made a bad decision, or sometimes we ask our kids the question, what were you thinking? And we could probably answer the same thing. We don't know that we were thinking when we made that decision.
Or maybe the logic wasn't, it made sense to me in the moment, And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, how sometimes we convince ourselves of certain things, but in the moment it made perfect sense as to why I made that decision. But it probably has happened to you when you actually say it out loud of how you came to that decision. At some point you're like, yeah, I probably should not have done that. It doesn't make any sense anymore. So if we could make decisions in an emotionally neutral environment, how much would that help us out?
Probably it would help me a whole lot.
Yeah.
I usually get my emotions cause the bad decisions.
Why is that?
That's a good question. I wish I knew the magic answer on that question. But usually when we're caught up with our emotions, we let our emotions influence our decisions too much, and that's when we don't think as well about our decisions.
Yeah, it's almost like it's easier to tell somebody else what to do because you can look at their situation and you're almost looking at it emotionally neutral. Especially if it's like a friend or if it's a decision that they're kind of laying it out and working through it, you're able to look at that and just say, well, you need to do this because this is the logical decision. But if the roles were reversed and it's you or I making that decision, Well, it's different because now there's more on the line. I'm either invested more or my emotions get in the way, kind of overcomplicate things in my mind, or I convince myself of some things. So I came across this quote from this book. It's from Clay Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School. And he said, questions are places in your mind where answers fit. If you haven't asked the question, the answer has nowhere to go. It hits your mind and bounces right off. You have to ask the question. You have to want to know in order to open up the space for the answer to fit. So sometimes when we make bad decisions, it's because we haven't asked enough questions and probably because we haven't asked the right questions. So what are some questions you ask yourself when it's time to make a pretty big decision?
Well, when we talk about answering questions, most of the time that means we have to think about our answer. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to making a big decision, sometimes either talking it through or asking questions or asking someone else questions or getting them to ask us questions about our decision helps us think through that and talk it through to hopefully make a better decision.
Yeah. So I was thinking through some of the questions that like I might ask myself would be, is this going to make me happy? Is this what I want to do? Is this going to hurt me? How's this going to affect my family? Is anybody going to find out about this? Or who's going to know about what's going on? Is this going to bring me harm? And those are some good questions, but it's almost like they're incomplete. Maybe there are better questions that we can ask ourselves. So we're going to spend the next couple of weeks looking through individual questions and kind of diving in a little bit deeper to some of those questions. But here's something that's true for all of us. We are where we are because of the decisions that we have made. Do you agree?
I do. Life is full of adventure and activities and things, and our life is made up of accumulation of all these little situations and events and decisions. Even like when we talk about making decisions, there's significant decisions and there's insignificant decisions, but sometimes it's those insignificant decisions that can lead down a path that causes us more harm. For example, what you wore tonight, what I wore tonight, what shirt we wear, isn't really a big decision, but had you worn like Ohio State, next week, that might be a little bit different, but had you decided not to wear a shirt on Facebook Live, that might be a bigger decision. But sometimes our little decisions put us down a path to follow that path, and it's these little decisions that cause us to make a bigger decision. And that's either headed in the right direction or it can lead us down a path in the wrong direction.
And sometimes there's what we think are insignificant decisions that wind up becoming monumental.
Absolutely.
We had no idea that it was such a big deal. Or it wasn't a big decision for me, but it was for my family or my place of employment or my friends in my life. And they're going, what were you doing? Well, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I can't tell you how many times I've said that, and made a quick decision and wound up being a big deal to somebody. What can we, let me kind of read this. It says, how we respond to somebody else's decision is still a decision that we make. What comes to mind when you hear that?
Well, it means a couple things. Number one, your decisions do affect me, and I at least have to respond to it. Either I can respond to it by ignoring or acting on it, supporting you in it, or trying to encourage you to go a different direction. But also, we make decisions all the time. Even the decision to do nothing is a decision.
Yes.
So that's what I think about when you said that.
The thing that kind of came to my mind was, sometimes I can, and we as people can sort of not play the victim, but I can kind of take a passive position. Well, I don't really have a choice in this matter. They made the decision for me. Well, that's not totally true. There may be things out of our control, but how I respond, specifically maybe in my attitude or in my outlook on that situation, is a decision that I get to make. Right. If boss comes and says, hey, I need you to do this, well, I may not have a choice. I may have to do that, but my attitude towards it is my decision in that regard. And so that's something that we kind of keep in mind. There may be somebody that hurt you, that did something awful to you, and you get to decide how you're going to respond to it. There was something hurtful done, but your response is totally within your control. And so there is a part of our life that, and this might be the only part of our life that is in our control, is how we actually respond to things that happen to us. Instead of kind of taking a passive role and saying, well, that's just totally out of my control. So we talked a little bit about a minute ago why it's easier to tell somebody else what to do instead of doing it ourselves, because we can't make decisions in an emotionally neutral environment. We talked a little bit about our emotions, but let's talk a little bit about like our appetite, talking about our desires. How does that affect our decisions? What do you think?
Well, it has everything to do with our decisions, and I was talking to you a little bit ago. It's mentioned, interesting you mentioned the word desire, because in Genesis 4, we have one of these neat conversations where God's talking with a human, and that doesn't occur too many times in the Bible.
Yeah.
But in Genesis 4, in the early part, in particular verse 7, God is talking to Cain, and this is before he kills his brother, and he mentions the word desire, and what he said, just real quickly here, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell, and the Lord said to Cain, so this is a conversation, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? And he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? So I think that's kind of what we're talking about. If you do well, if you make a good decision, will you not be accepted?
Yeah.
But he says, and if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So we have this decision to do what's right, and it's what we want to do. And we have sin crouching at the door through Satan, and we're talking about overcoming or ruling over that. So as we make decisions, we're talking about really looking at our desire and then making a decision, a positive decision to rule over our desire.
Yeah, that's a great passage and a great point. I've always been fascinated by that passage because the author of Genesis takes, as God is talking, he takes sin and personifies it, or makes it look like a creature. It's like this tiger or lion that's crouching, ready to pounce. And I think, I could never conquer an animal like that. But he says you can rule over it, and you must rule over it. So there's an ability there. There should be a confidence there. And there's an opportunity that we can decide, I will not be conquered right now. I will make this choice for my best interest. And I love that God pointed that out to Cain. Unfortunately, he didn't make the right decision and allowed that sin to overtake his desires. But it's a really neat exercise.
A little follow-up on that, if we remember, after that he made the poor decision and God comes back to him, he tells him his punishment, and he's going to be banished and all this kind of thing, and people are going to seek after him and that kind of thing. And he says, my punishment is too great. I cannot bear it. Just a thought, we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we've made mistakes and we think we can't live with that mistake.
Yeah.
I can't bear it. The reality is we've all messed up. And God tells Cain, let me find it here. The Lord says to him in verse 15, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. So here's God issuing punishment, but at the same time saying, yes, you can bear it.
Yeah.
You can bear it. And I guess the lesson for us, our decisions have consequences. Sometimes it's rewards, not necessarily negative consequences. But we can bear even those mistakes through God's help.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been in sales before?
Some would say education is sales.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess in some way I did sell fireworks.
Okay.
We had a fireworks stand, so I guess
Really?
that counts.
How long ago was that? I'm curious.
That's before kids.
Okay. Did you do well?
We got out of the business, so I guess that means no, we didn't. We
Okay.
survived. It
Yeah.
was a way we helped pay Christmas when we were young and broke and had no money.
Yeah.
But after about getting held up one time, I said, no, that's enough of
Oh.
that. It's not worth it.
People love fireworks. They want their fireworks. Yeah. I've never had a desire to be in sales. My dad retired from. He was in sales for a long time. I've always joked he could sell you anything. You know, he could sell you your own stuff, and he's just really talented at it. I'm, I guess a little bit in ministry. You're not selling Jesus, but you're putting forth this life, and this is what God's calling us to. And as a minister and preacher, there's a little bit of like presentation that goes into it. So I don't know if that's any form of sales. I'm sure it's principles that apply, but I am really good at selling myself on a lot of things. I mean, I can convince myself of some crazy stuff. Have you had that experience with yourself?
Absolutely. And sometimes we have poor sale jobs and positive sale jobs. And sometimes we sell ourselves that we can do something. I'll give you just a quick example. One of our teachers, who's actually a member at Regency, but I'll keep his name quiet.
Okay.
Some will know who I'm talking about because this was mentioned to our whole faculty yesterday in a devotional. But he had a water leak in his yard, and he was convinced, he sold himself that he could do the job. So he looked up videos, YouTube, I guess, or whatever, and said, okay, I can do this. I can fix this water leak in my yard. And he digs it up and he does what it says, but he didn't do it quite right the first time. So he had to do it again. So he had to dig up more. Well, that led to some roots that were around the water pipe. So then he has to break out an axe to get after the roots. And then when he goes to chop the roots, he actually hits a sewer line. And so it gets bigger.
Yeah.
But I guess he kind of sold himself, hey, I can do this.
Yeah.
The good news is he did get it patched, but I think he has to get a plumber to come back out and fix it up a little bit more.
I've sold myself many times the thought that I can do plumbing, and it's never worked out either. And that was not me who had the plumbing issue, but we won't mention Garen by name. But totally understand how that can happen. Thinking we can do something. I want to mention a comment that Mike Shavers made on Facebook that I find really interesting. He said, what about decisions that have to be made on the spot with no chance to think it through? Police officers have to make a decision that has a serious outcome, such as life or death, in a second. We're taught to think of what can happen and make multiple decisions based on what a suspect does. Christians could use this too. If I have already made a choice while I have time to think through a decision. And I think that's really interesting. What does that, talk through that a little bit.
Well, that's talking about being purposeful and thinking ahead, asking yourselves the questions. And I think what he's alluding to is what you mentioned a little bit ago about asking ourselves those questions beforehand or about that. And so to me, that's best, even when we try to teach our kids that, tell them. Matter of fact, today I had a conversation with a student that's about to go off to college and say, this is what you're going to face when you get there, or what you may face. I have the feeling you're going to face this, and I encourage you to make the right decision. In other words, similar to what Mike is talking about, is to think through about that, so that when the time comes and it has to be made split second, you make the right call on that because you've thought about it in advance.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure with police officers that training goes into a lot of it, and then after that situation, you spend time kind of thinking through, replaying that moment, that scene in your mind. And I think his point for us as Christians is good too, that say I have a moment where I didn't make a good decision. It was a split second or a quick decision that had to be made. And I look back on it and I'm like, that wasn't the best. Spend some time reflecting on that. how did I get to that moment? Why did I decide this? What was going through my heart at that time? If we don't do any kind of introspection, I don't think we're ever going to get better at making decisions. And as he mentioned, officers have to make decisions really quickly and work through a lot of scenarios in just a really quick amount of time, situation I couldn't fathom. But I think there are some principles that can apply for us as Christians, when there's a situation of temptation. That's a time where you've got to make some decisions quickly. And if that's the first time you're asking yourself those questions, you're probably going to fail. You've got to work through that before you get into that moment. So I want to share this verse, kind of going back to this idea of selling ourselves on some good things. This comes from Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And that verse, I try to remind myself a lot of that verse because my heart has lied to me many times. This is something I definitely need to do, or I definitely want to do, or this is something I need to have. And later it's like, man, my heart lied to me. I didn't have to do that. I didn't need that. I shouldn't have made that decision. What can we do to keep our heart in check so that it's not so deceitful for us?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I hadn't thought about that before you mentioned it, but the verse that came to mind was the one, and I wish I could recall the actual scripture, but it says, guard your heart, for out of it are the well springs of life. So I think we've got to guard our heart, protect it, make decisions of, okay, these are my weak points. And so this is where I know I'm vulnerable. And so I've got to put up some defense there to watch over that. And that's actually what God was encouraging Cain to do. Sin is lurking there at the door, and so rule over it, So I think that's part of it.
Any other thoughts you have as we kind of wrap up tonight?
Well, you're talking about decisions. One thing is that I was thinking of is on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says some things like, you've heard not to kill, but I tell you not to be angry. And so what I think he's encouraging us to do in that is watch the direction of our decisions. These little decisions lead to other things. Same thing like you've heard not to commit adultery, but I ask you not to look to lust on a woman. And so he's talking about taking a step back and watch the direction of those things. And so as we look at decisions, most of the time when we talk about our choices and decisions, we think about the bad choices. But there's also the positive choices, and we all have choices to make. And I think the key is tonight, are we going to decide to make positive choices or negative choices? And this is a great time of year to be thinking about those things and making those decisions. It was neat here just last week that we had someone that made a decision, I'm going to get right with God. And he was seeking and comes in. He had been watching online with us and comes in and has made a decision, I'm going to go in this direction. He didn't quite know exactly what that was, but he had made a choice. I'm going to go toward God. And he ended up being baptized, and he was just so excited this past Sunday to come back and be able to take the Lord's Supper for first time and those kind of things. And he was excited about that. So I think just kind of my thoughts in wrapping up is we can make positive choices or negative choices. We can't dwell on those negative choices, the bad ones, maybe learn from them and decide to do better. But hey, let's make some positive choices and rejoice over others that have made positive choices.
Celebrate the wins and learn from the losses.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to share with you a verse. So there's going to be times where you've got decisions to make and you don't know what to do, kind of at a loss. It seems like, there's not a great decision to be made. It may be a lose-lose, or, it's debatable whether you can be successful in that decision. James 1:5, I think, is really powerful. If you lack wisdom, let that person ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to them. And so we got to remember in that moment, as we're talking through, and we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about some questions we need to ask ourselves. one of the questions should be, have I prayed about this? You know, if I got to, even if it doesn't seem like it's a big decision, but there's a possibility it could be, have I prayed about this? I think that's really important for us to remember. So next week, we're going to look at the question, am I being honest with myself? Really, am I being honest with myself? So look forward to being back together. We'll be back here next week, Wednesday night at 6:30. Hope that you'll join us again. Appreciate you being with us tonight and hope you have a great night.